Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. The morning fog clings to the Blue Ridge Mountains like a shroud of forgotten prayers, thick and gray over the tobacco fields of Watauga County, North Carolina. It is March of 1911, and the winter cold still bites through the thin wooden walls of the cabins scattered across these ancient hills. In a small hollow near the town of Boone, a woman named Martha Henley wakes before dawn, as she has every day for the past 3 years since her husband died in the coal mines of neighboring Tennessee. She is 32 years old, though the hardness of mountain life has carved lines around her eyes that make her appear older. Her hands are rough from washing clothes in the creek, from tending the small vegetable garden behind her cabin, from the endless labor that defines the existence of women in these isolated communities. Martha's cabin sits at the edge of a narrow dirt road that winds through the hollow, connecting a dozen families who survive on subsistence farming, occasional work in the timber industry, and the unpredictable generosity of wealthier families in Boone. The cabin itself is modest, 2 rooms with a stone fireplace that provides the only heat during the brutal mountain winters. The roof leaks when the spring rains come, and the floorboards creak with every step, but it is hers, paid for with money her husband saved before his death. She shares it with no one now except the memories of better times and the persistent loneliness that has become her constant companion. The town of Boone, 3 miles down the mountain, serves as the commercial and spiritual center for the scattered families of the region. On Sundays, the Baptist church fills with farmers and their families, dressed in their only good clothes, listening to Reverend Samuel Blackwell preach about sin and redemption, about the importance of moral purity in these mountains where temptation lurks in the form of moonshine stills and loose women and the Catholic railroad workers who pass through on their way to larger cities. Reverend Blackwell is a tall man with steel-gray hair and eyes that seem to look directly into the souls of his congregation, finding every secret shame and unspoken desire. He has led the First Baptist Church of Boone for 15 years, and his word carries the weight of divine authority in this community where the church provides not only spiritual guidance but also social structure and moral judgment. Martha stopped attending church 6 months after her husband died. At first, the congregation attributed her absence to grief, and the church women brought her casseroles and bread, offered prayers and sympathy. But as the months stretched into a year and then 2, the sympathy curdled into suspicion. Widows were expected to remarry quickly or live with family, to remain visible and accountable to the community's watchful eyes. Martha did neither. She remained alone in her cabin, supporting herself through work that gradually became the subject of whispered speculation among the women who gathered at the general store and the men who drank corn whiskey behind the lumber mill. The truth of Martha's situation began with simple acts of kindness. In the winter of 1910, a traveling salesman named Henry Parsons arrived in the hollow during a fierce snowstorm, his wagon wheel broken beyond immediate repair. Martha invited him into her cabin, fed him a meal of beans and cornbread, and allowed him to sleep by the fireplace while the storm raged outside. In the morning, grateful for her hospitality and moved by the obvious poverty in which she lived, Henry left her $5, an enormous sum for a widow surviving on washing and mending. He told her she had given him more than shelter, she had given him comfort and human warmth in a harsh and lonely world, and for that, he wanted to show his appreciation. The money allowed Martha to buy flour and salt pork, to repair the worst of the roof leaks, to survive another month without begging from neighbors who had little enough themselves. More importantly, the encounter awakened something in Martha that had lain dormant since her husband's death. She had felt, for those few hours, like a person again rather than just a burden or an object of pity. The man had spoken to her with respect, had listened to her stories about her life, had looked at her with an expression that was not pity but genuine appreciation. In the isolation of mountain widowhood, such recognition felt more valuable than gold. Over the following months, other men found their way to Martha's door. Some were traveling salesmen like Henry, others were timber workers passing through the region. A few were local men whose wives had died or who lived alone in distant cabins. They came seeking the same thing Henry had found, not just physical shelter but emotional refuge, a place where they could speak freely about their fears and failures, where they could experience tenderness and understanding without judgment. Martha provided this refuge willingly, even eagerly. She cooked meals, listened to their stories, offered comfort in whatever form they needed. Some men simply wanted conversation and a warm meal. Others wanted more intimate comfort, the touch of gentle hands, the feeling of being desired and valued. Martha never thought of herself as selling anything immoral. In her mind, shaped by years of Sunday sermons about Christian charity and the commandment to love one's neighbor, she was providing a service that the church claimed to offer but rarely delivered: genuine compassion and acceptance for broken and lonely souls. She charged no fixed price but accepted whatever gifts the men chose to leave, money when they had it, food or supplies when they did not. She justified her actions through her own interpretation of Scripture, particularly the passages about Mary Magdalene and Jesus' compassion for sinners and outcasts. If Jesus could dine with prostitutes and tax collectors, Martha reasoned, surely there was nothing sinful in offering comfort to lonely men who harmed no one and sought only a brief respite from their hard lives. The arrangement remained relatively discreet through the summer and fall of 1910. The men who visited Martha's cabin were not local residents but travelers who passed through once and never returned, or isolated mountain men who kept to themselves and had no standing in the community. Martha lived quietly, attended to her garden, and bothered no one. But in December of that year, everything changed when Thomas Mercer, a respected farmer and deacon at First Baptist Church, was seen leaving Martha's cabin late one evening by Rebecca Sutton, a neighbor woman whose cabin sat just visible through the trees across the hollow. Rebecca Sutton was a widow herself, 60 years old and bitter about the poverty and hardship that had defined her life. She survived on the charity of her son's family and the meager assistance provided by the church, and she resented anyone who seemed to be managing better than she was without the proper submission to community expectations. Seeing Thomas Mercer, a married man and church leader, emerging from Martha Henley's cabin after dark filled Rebecca with righteous fury. She understood immediately what was happening, or thought she did, and she determined to expose this sin to the proper authorities. The next morning, Rebecca walked the 3 miles into Boone and went directly to Reverend Blackwell's house behind the church. She told him everything she had seen, embellishing the story with her own assumptions about what had transpired inside Martha's cabin. The Reverend listened with a grave expression, his fingers steepled under his chin, his eyes cold with anger at this confirmation of his suspicions about Martha Henley. He had never trusted the widow's absence from church, had always sensed something improper in her solitary existence. Now he had evidence of actual sin, not just the appearance of it. Reverend Blackwell thanked Rebecca for her vigilance and promised to address the situation immediately. That afternoon, he convened an emergency meeting of the church deacons, 7 men who served as the moral arbiters of the community. They met in the small room behind the church sanctuary, sitting around a rough wooden table, their faces stern with the gravity of their purpose. The Reverend explained the situation in detail, describing Martha Henley as a woman who had fallen into prostitution, who was corrupting the morals of the community and leading good Christian men into sin. He painted a picture of moral decay spreading through the hollow like a disease, threatening the spiritual health of every family in the region. The deacons listened with varying degrees of shock and outrage. Some had known Martha's husband, had considered him a good man, and found it difficult to believe his widow would fall so far. Others, particularly the older men who held rigid views about women's proper behavior, accepted the Reverend's characterization without question. They discussed what should be done, whether they should confront Martha directly, whether they should involve the sheriff, whether the situation required public exposure or could be handled discreetly. Thomas Mercer, the deacon whose visit to Martha's cabin had sparked the crisis, sat silent and pale, knowing that his own reputation hung in the balance. Finally, Reverend Blackwell proposed a course of action. He would visit Martha Henley himself, accompanied by 2 deacons, and demand that she cease her sinful activities immediately, repent publicly before the congregation, and submit herself to the church's guidance and discipline. If she refused, they would expose her publicly, warning every family in the region about the danger she represented, and they would pressure the landlord who owned her cabin to evict her, forcing her to leave the community entirely. The deacons agreed to this plan, relieved to have a clear course of action that preserved both their authority and the community's moral standards. The winter evening grows dark early in the mountains, and Martha Henley lights her oil lamps against the gathering shadows, unaware that forces are already moving against her, that the fragile peace she has built for herself is about to shatter. She sits by her fireplace, mending a shirt torn by her work in the garden, thinking about the money she has saved, enough perhaps to make it through the winter without hunger, enough to give her a small measure of security in a world that offers widows very little. She does not yet know that security is an illusion, that the same community that ignored her poverty now prepares to punish her for finding her own solution to it. Morning arrives cold and clear over the hollow, frost coating the bare branches of oak and hickory trees, the creek running swift and dark over smooth stones worn by centuries of water. Martha wakes to the sound of horses approaching on the dirt road, an unusual occurrence in this isolated part of the county where most travel happens on foot or by mule. She rises from her bed, wraps a shawl around her shoulders against the cold, and peers through the small window near her door. 3 men on horseback are making their way up the road toward her cabin, and even from a distance, she recognizes Reverend Blackwell's tall figure and black coat. A chill runs through Martha that has nothing to do with the morning temperature. She knows instinctively that this visit carries judgment rather than pastoral care, that somehow her private arrangements have become public knowledge. She feels a mixture of fear and defiance rising in her chest, the fear born of a lifetime spent in a world where women have little power to defend themselves against male authority, the defiance born of 3 years of survival against overwhelming odds, of learning that she can endure things she never imagined possible. She straightens her shoulders, smooths her hair back from her face, and prepares to meet whatever comes with as much dignity as she can muster. The Reverend and his companions, Deacon William Harrison and Deacon James Tate, dismount in front of Martha's cabin and tie their horses to the fence post that marks the boundary of her small property. Reverend Blackwell approaches the door with slow, deliberate steps, his face set in an expression of stern disapproval mixed with something that might be satisfaction at finally having grounds to confront a woman who has defied his authority by her very absence from his church. He knocks on the door hard enough to make it rattle in its frame, a knock that demands submission rather than requests entry. Martha opens the door and stands in the doorway, blocking entry to her home, meeting the Reverend's gaze directly despite the fear churning in her stomach. She greets them formally, asking what brings them to her home at such an early hour. Reverend Blackwell wastes no time with pleasantries. He informs her that reports have reached the church about her activities, about men visiting her cabin at inappropriate hours, about behavior unbecoming a Christian woman and particularly shocking in a widow who should be modeling propriety and moral rectitude. He uses words like harlot and Jezebel, words designed to shame and diminish, to reduce her complex circumstances to simple sin. Martha feels the words like physical blows, but she refuses to cower or apologize. She invites them to speak freely but will not invite them inside her home, establishing a boundary that asserts her right to privacy even as they attempt to strip it away. She tells them that she has done nothing wrong, that she has provided comfort and companionship to lonely people, that she has survived through her own efforts without being a burden to anyone. She speaks about Christian charity, about Jesus's teachings on compassion and non-judgment, about the hypocrisy of a church that preaches love while condemning a widow for offering human kindness. The Reverend's face darkens with anger at her refusal to accept his characterization of her behavior, at her audacity in quoting scripture to defend actions he considers indefensible. He tells her that she has corrupted men's souls, that she has led them into adultery and fornication, that she has created a den of iniquity in a community that strives for righteousness. He demands that she cease all such activities immediately, that she present herself before the congregation the following Sunday to publicly confess her sins and beg forgiveness, and that she submit herself to the church's supervision going forward, accepting whatever restrictions and guidance they deem necessary to restore her to proper Christian behavior. Martha listens to these demands with a sinking heart, knowing that compliance would mean the end of her independence, the end of the only means she has found to support herself with any dignity. Church supervision would mean constant surveillance, restriction to the most menial and poorly paid work, probably forced relocation to live with a church family where she would serve essentially as an unpaid servant in exchange for basic sustenance. She has seen this happen to other women who fell afoul of church authority, has watched them become shadows, their spirits broken by constant humiliation disguised as moral rehabilitation. She tells the Reverend that she will not comply with his demands, that she answers to God and her own conscience rather than to men who judge without understanding, who speak of Christian love while showing none. She points out the church's failure to provide for her after her husband's death, the indifference of the congregation to her poverty and isolation, the way they forgot her as soon as the initial sympathy faded. She asks them where their Christian charity was when she was going hungry, when her roof was leaking, when she lay awake at night wondering how she would survive another winter. She tells them they have no right to judge her for finding her own path to survival when they offered her nothing but prayers and judgment. The two deacons shift uncomfortably during this exchange, both men aware of the truth in Martha's accusations even if they cannot acknowledge it publicly. The church's charitable efforts are sporadic and insufficient, focused primarily on families with men who attend services regularly, often bypassing widows and single women unless they have family members to advocate for them. William Harrison, the younger of the two deacons, finds himself unexpectedly moved by Martha's defiance, by the clear evidence of intelligence and strength in this woman whom the Reverend has characterized as a simple sinner in need of correction. Reverend Blackwell, however, shows no such uncertainty. He informs Martha that her refusal to repent and submit leaves the church no choice but to take more severe action. He will announce her sins from the pulpit, warn all Christian families to avoid her, and encourage the owner of her cabin to evict her for immoral use of the property. He will write to the authorities in the county seat, recommending that they investigate her for prostitution and take whatever legal action is warranted. He tells her that she has chosen the path of the damned, and the consequences will be hers alone to bear. Martha stands firm despite the threats, her voice steady as she tells them they must do what they believe necessary, but she will not apologize for survival, will not accept shame for providing comfort when the world offered only hardness. She closes the door on them, cutting off the Reverend's response, hearing him shout warnings through the closed door before finally mounting his horse and riding away with his companions. She leans against the door, her legs suddenly weak, her heart pounding, knowing that her life is about to become infinitely more difficult but unable to see any path forward that does not involve either submission or continued defiance. The Reverend wastes no time implementing his threats. That same afternoon, he visits John Whitaker, a wealthy farmer who owns Martha's cabin along with several other properties in the hollow, collecting modest rents that supplement his considerable income from tobacco farming. He tells Whitaker about Martha's activities, framing them in the most damaging possible terms, emphasizing the moral contamination spreading through the community and Whitaker's own responsibility as a Christian property owner to prevent his buildings from being used for immoral purposes. He reminds Whitaker that he has a daughter of marriageable age, and association with impropriety could damage her prospects. Whitaker, a practical man more concerned with his reputation and business interests than with abstract morality, agrees readily to evict Martha. He gives her 30 days to vacate the property, the minimum notice required by custom if not by law, and he makes it clear that he will tolerate no appeals or delays. When he delivers the eviction notice to Martha's cabin the next morning, he does so without meeting her eyes, his discomfort evident but not sufficient to overcome his fear of being associated with scandal. News of Martha's situation spreads through the community with the speed of wildfire in dry timber. Within days, everyone in the Hollow and in Boone itself knows about the widow who sold herself to traveling men, about the Reverend's confrontation and her defiant response, about her impending eviction. The story grows in the telling, acquiring details that may or may not be true, transforming Martha from a struggling widow into a figure of either scandal or sympathy depending on who tells the tale. The women of the community largely condemn her, viewing her behavior as a threat to their own marriages and to the social order that gives them what little security they possess. The men's reactions are more varied, some genuinely outraged by perceived immorality, others secretly sympathetic to both Martha's desperation and the needs of the lonely men who sought her comfort, a few worried about their own potential exposure if the investigation continues. Thomas Mercer, the deacon whose visit to Martha's cabin initiated the crisis, finds himself in an impossible position. His wife has heard the rumors and demands to know if he was among Martha's visitors. He denies it vehemently, claims he merely stopped to check on her welfare as a Christian duty, but his wife's suspicion festers like an infected wound. His reputation on the church board is compromised, his authority diminished by association with scandal. He begins to hate Martha not for what she did but for the consequences her exposure has brought upon him, and this hatred will drive him to become one of her most vocal opponents in the months to come. Martha faces the reality of her situation with a determination forged by 3 years of solitary survival. She has 30 days to find a new home, but no one in the community will rent to her now, and she lacks the resources to purchase property or to relocate to a different county where her reputation has not preceded her. She continues her daily routines, tending her garden, washing clothes in the creek, preparing for the coming spring planting even though she knows she will not be present to harvest what she sows. She maintains her dignity in the face of hostile stares when she walks into Boone for supplies, refusing to hide or apologize, meeting judgment with steady composure that only inflames her critics further. And the second week after the confrontation, Martha receives unexpected visitors. 3 women arrive at her cabin in late afternoon, approaching cautiously as if afraid of being seen. They are young wives, married to farmers and timber workers, women Martha recognizes from her early days of church attendance though she does not know them well. The oldest of them, a woman named Sarah Coleman, speaks for the group. She tells Martha that they have come to hear her side of the story, that they are troubled by the rush to judgment they have witnessed, that they want to understand what really happened before forming their own opinions. Martha invites them inside and tells them everything, speaking honestly about her situation after her husband's death, about the loneliness and poverty that defined her existence, about the traveling salesman who first showed her that survival might take forms the church did not approve. She speaks about the men who came to her seeking comfort, about her belief that she was providing something valuable and needed, something the church claimed to offer but rarely delivered to those who needed it most. She does not minimize or excuse her actions but presents them in their full complexity, asking the women to imagine themselves in her position, alone and hungry with no prospects for remarriage, no family to take them in, no church willing to provide more than token assistance. The 3 women listen with expressions ranging from shock to sympathy to recognition. Sarah Coleman, married to a man whose drinking and violent temper make her own life a daily struggle, finds herself understanding Martha's choices in ways that frighten her. If she were widowed, what would she do? How would she survive? The church would offer prayers but little practical help, and remarriage would likely mean trading one difficult situation for another. Martha's path, however scandalous, represents a form of independence that Sarah has never considered possible for a woman in their world. The women leave Martha's cabin without offering any concrete assistance, unable to risk their own reputations by openly supporting her, but their visit plants seeds that will grow in unexpected directions. Sarah begins to question the church's teachings about women's proper roles, begins to see the structures of power and control that keep women dependent and vulnerable. She shares these thoughts with other women in quiet conversations, careful not to attract the attention of husbands or church leaders, and slowly, invisibly, a current of sympathy for Martha begins to flow beneath the surface of public condemnation. Reverend Blackwell, sensing that his complete victory over Martha is not yet assured, decides to use the power of his pulpit to cement public opinion against her. The following Sunday, he delivers a sermon titled The Wages of Sin, using Martha's situation as the central example without naming her directly, though everyone present knows exactly whom he means. He speaks about the corruption of women who abandon proper Christian modesty, about the temptations such women represent to weak men, about the necessity of driving evil from the community before it spreads like a cancer. He reads passages from Proverbs about the loose woman who leads men to destruction, from Corinthians about casting out the immoral person from among you. He works his congregation into a state of righteous fury, calling for them to shun the sinner completely, to refuse all contact or commerce with her, to make it impossible for her to remain in their community. The sermon achieves its intended effect. In the days that follow, Martha finds herself completely isolated. The general store refuses to sell her supplies, forcing her to walk an additional 5 miles to a smaller establishment in a neighboring hollow. Neighbors who once nodded greetings now turn away when she passes. Children throw stones at her cabin and run away laughing. Someone paints the word whore on her door in crude letters, an act of vandalism that no one investigates or condemns. The systematic destruction of her ability to remain in the community proceeds with the organized efficiency of a group certain of its moral righteousness. Yet Martha endures. She cleans the paint from her door, tends her garden, maintains her cabin as if she will be living there indefinitely. She refuses to give her tormentors the satisfaction of seeing her broken or humiliated. When she walks through the hollow, she keeps her head high and her expression calm, a posture of defiance that costs her enormously in emotional energy but preserves her sense of self in the face of relentless assault. She begins to understand that this struggle is no longer just about her survival but about something larger, about a woman's right to determine her own path even when that path violates the norms that men have established to control women's lives and bodies. The month of April brings volatile weather to the North Carolina mountains. Warm days followed by sudden storms that turn dirt roads to impassable mud and swell creeks to dangerous levels. Martha's 30-day eviction period expires on April 15th, and John Whitaker arrives at her cabin with the sheriff and 2 deputies to ensure her compliance. She has spent the previous weeks packing her meager possessions, preparing for an uncertain future, but she has nowhere to go, no destination that offers even the possibility of shelter and survival. She tells them she needs more time to make arrangements, that turning her out now would be a death sentence, but they are unmoved by her pleas. The sheriff, a man named Robert Daniels who holds his position through political appointment rather than any particular qualification or sense of justice, informs Martha that she has 1 hour to remove her belongings from the cabin before he will remove them himself and padlock the door. He makes no secret of his distaste for this duty, not out of sympathy for Martha but because he resents being drawn into church politics when he has actual crimes to investigate. Nevertheless, he will enforce the eviction because refusing would cost him the support of Reverend Blackwell and the church members who form a powerful voting bloc in the county. Martha carries her possessions out of the cabin, piling them under a nearby tree where they will at least have some shelter from rain. Her belongings amount to pathetically little after 3 years of widowhood. A few clothes, some cooking implements, bedding, the small Bible her mother gave her when she married. She moves with deliberate slowness, refusing to be rushed, maintaining her dignity even in this moment of complete defeat. The men watch her with a mixture of impatience and discomfort, aware on some level that they are participating in a profound injustice but unwilling to question the authority that commands their actions. When everything is removed, the sheriff padlocks the cabin door and hands the key to Whitaker, and the men mount their horses and ride away without another word to Martha, leaving her standing beside her pile of possessions with the spring sun warming her back and no idea where she will sleep. That night, she sits down on a fallen log and allows herself a moment of despair, feeling the weight of isolation and persecution pressing down on her with crushing force. For the first time since her husband's death, she considers simply giving up, walking into the forest and letting the mountains take her, ending the struggle that seems increasingly futile, but the moment passes. Martha remembers something her grandmother told her when she was a child, that women are like the mountains themselves, worn down by time and weather but fundamentally unbreakable, enduring through sheer stubborn refusal to yield. She stands up, assesses her situation practically, and begins to formulate a plan. She cannot stay in the hollow where everyone knows her and reviles her, but she also cannot leave entirely with nowhere to go and no resources. She will make a temporary camp in the forest, hidden from the road and from her former neighbors, and she will survive there while she determines her next steps. Martha spends the next week living rough in the woods, sleeping under a canvas tarp strung between trees, cooking over a small fire, rationing the food supplies she managed to purchase before the stores refused her business. It is a hard existence, cold at night despite the advancing spring, lonely and frightening in its complete isolation, but it is also strangely liberating. For the first time in years, Martha is answerable to no one, subject to no judgment but her own, free from the constant surveillance and criticism that defined her life in the community. She finds herself thinking with unusual clarity about her situation and her choices, about what she truly believes versus what she has been taught to believe. During these days of solitude, Martha reaches a decision that will determine the course of the rest of her life. She will not apologize or repent for actions she does not believe were wrong. She will not accept the church's judgment or submit to their control. Instead, she will fight back, Not with violence or confrontation, but by exposing the hypocrisy and cruelty she has experienced, by telling her story publicly and forcing the community to confront the consequences of its righteousness. She does not have a clear plan for how to do this, but the decision itself fills her with renewed energy and purpose. The opportunity to act on this decision comes from an unexpected source. William Harrison, the younger deacon who accompanied Reverend Blackwell on his initial confrontation with Martha, has been troubled by everything he has witnessed over the past month. He is 35 years old, married to a woman he loves but does not understand, father to 3 children who consume his time and energy. He farms a modest plot of land and serves on the church board out of genuine religious conviction rather than social ambition. Unlike many in the congregation, he takes seriously the teachings about compassion and justice, and he has found himself increasingly unable to reconcile those teachings with the church's treatment of Martha Henley. Harrison makes discreet inquiries about Martha's whereabouts, learning from a child who saw her heading into the forest with her belongings that she has been camping somewhere in the woods north of the hollow. One evening after completing his farm work, he walks into the forest following the creek until he finds her small camp, calling out as he approaches so as not to startle her. Martha emerges from behind a tree, wary and defensive, unsure whether this man has come to threaten her further or to offer assistance. Harrison explains that he has come to help if he can, that he is ashamed of his role in her eviction and the persecution she has suffered, that he wants to find a way to make amends. Martha studies him carefully, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives, but she sees only genuine distress and a desire to do the right thing. She invites him to sit by her fire, offers him coffee made from ground she has already used 3 times, and they talk as the spring darkness settles over the forest. Harrison tells Martha about his own doubts regarding Reverend Blackwell's leadership, about his growing conviction that the church has strayed from true Christian principles in favor of rigid moralism and social control. He speaks about his wife's illness the previous winter, about the church's failure to provide any real assistance despite their family's faithful service, about his realization that the institution's primary concern is maintaining power rather than serving its members. He has been thinking about leaving the church, but such a decision would have devastating social consequences for his family, cutting them off from their entire support network. Martha listens with growing interest, seeing in Harrison a potential ally but also recognizing the risk he would take by openly supporting her. She asks him what he proposes to do, how he imagines he can help her when he himself is caught in the same system that has destroyed her life. Harrison admits he does not have a complete plan, but he suggests that she write down her story, everything that happened to her and why, and that he will help her distribute it throughout the county, forcing people to confront a narrative that contradicts the church's version of events. The idea excites Martha immediately. She has always been more literate than most women in her community, taught to read and write by her mother who valued education despite the limited opportunities available to mountain girls. She can write her story in a way that presents the truth of her situation without apologizing for her choices, that exposes the church's hypocrisy and cruelty, that gives voice to the voiceless widows and struggling women whose suffering goes unacknowledged. The written word, she knows, has power that spoken words lack, permanence and reach that her individual voice cannot achieve. Over the next 2 weeks, Martha writes her account, composing it on paper that Harrison brings her, working by firelight in the evenings after her daily struggle to find food and maintain her camp. She writes about her marriage and her husband's death, about the poverty and loneliness of widowhood, about the church's indifference to her suffering, about the traveling salesman who first offered her payment for kindness, about her own philosophy of love and compassion as forms of Christian service. She writes about the confrontation with Reverend Blackwell, about the systematic campaign to destroy her reputation and drive her from the community, about the night someone tried to set fire to her camp while she slept, forcing her to relocate deeper into the forest. She titles her account A Widow's Testament, the practice of Christian charity in opposition to Pharisaical judgment. The title deliberately invokes biblical language, positioning her story within a religious framework that challenges the church on its own terms. She does not shy away from describing the intimate comfort she provided to lonely men, but she frames it as an extension of Christian love rather than prostitution, asking readers to consider whether genuine compassion can ever be sinful regardless of the form it takes. Harrison reads the completed manuscript with a mixture of admiration and fear. Martha's intelligence and eloquence shine through every paragraph, her argument is cogent and powerful, and her account of the church's treatment of her is damning. He knows that distributing this document will bring consequences for both of them, that Reverend Blackwell will view it as a direct attack on his authority and will respond with everything in his power. But he also knows that silence in the face of injustice is itself a form of participation in that injustice, and he has reached a point where he can no longer remain silent. Harrison takes Martha's manuscript to a printer in Boone, a man named Jacob Feldman who is Jewish and thus outside the Baptist Church's direct control. Feldman reads the document with great interest, immediately recognizing its potential to cause controversy and therefore to sell well. He agrees to print 200 copies at a price Harrison can barely afford, paying for the printing with money he has saved for his children's education, knowing his wife will be furious when she discovers what he has done. The printing takes 3 days, and when it is complete, Harrison and Feldman work together to distribute copies throughout Boone and to neighboring towns, leaving them in public places, mailing them to prominent citizens, ensuring that Martha's story reaches as many people as possible before the church can organize a response. The reaction to A Widow's Testament is immediate and explosive. Many readers are shocked by Martha's frank admission of providing intimate comfort to men, viewing it as confirmation of immorality regardless of her framing. But others, particularly women who have experienced the church's failure to provide practical support in times of crisis, find themselves sympathizing with Martha's situation and questioning the righteousness of her persecution. The document sparks fierce debates in homes and businesses throughout the county, forcing people to confront questions about morality, charity, women's autonomy, and the church's role in community life. Reverend Blackwell's response is swift and furious. He dedicates his next sermon to denouncing Martha's testament as a work of Satan, designed to corrupt the faithful and undermine godly authority. He calls on his congregation to gather every copy they can find and bring them to the church for burning, declaring that the document is too dangerous to remain in circulation. He organizes a public book burning in the town square, a spectacle that draws a large crowd, some supportive of the Reverend's action, others troubled by the symbolism of destroying written words regardless of their content. The book burning becomes a defining moment in the community's struggle over Martha Henley. As Reverend Blackwell lights the pyre of collected testaments, Sarah Coleman, the young wife who visited Martha weeks earlier, steps forward from the crowd and publicly objects, declaring that burning books is an act of tyranny, not righteousness, that truth should be confronted, not destroyed. Her husband tries to pull her back into the crowd, embarrassed and angry, but she shakes him off and continues speaking, her voice gaining strength as she articulates thoughts she has been forming for weeks. She asks the Reverend how they can know what is true if they refuse to hear all perspectives, how they can claim to serve justice if they silence those who challenge them, how their faith can be strong if it cannot withstand the questions raised by a widow's testimony. Other voices join Sarah's, both supporting and opposing her arguments, and the book burning devolves into a shouting match that threatens to become violent. Sheriff Daniels intervenes to prevent physical confrontation, but he cannot prevent the fundamental rupture that has opened in the community. The consensus that supported Martha's persecution has fractured, revealing divisions of opinion and loyalty that will reshape the social landscape of Watauga County in the years to come. Martha, still living in her forest camp, learns about the book burning from Harrison, who visits her regularly now without attempting to hide his actions. She is moved by Sarah Coleman's defense of her testament, by the evidence that her words have reached people and inspired at least some of them to question the authority that condemned her. For the first time since her eviction, she feels hope that her struggle might lead to something beyond personal survival, might contribute to changes that will benefit other vulnerable women in the future. The late spring of 1911 brings transformation to the mountains of North Carolina, not in any dramatic single event but through the accumulation of small changes in perception and practice. Martha Henley remains in exile, her forest camp gradually becoming more permanent as she constructs a small shelter from salvaged lumber and learns to hunt and forage with increasing skill. She has become a kind of ghost in the community's consciousness, physically absent but psychologically present, a symbol whose meaning varies depending on who invokes her name. the publication and burning of a widow's testament has created a schism within First Baptist Church that Reverend Blackwell cannot heal through sermons or threats. Sarah Coleman and 3 other women have stopped attending services, claiming they can no longer in good conscience support an institution that practices cruelty while preaching love. Their husbands face intense pressure to bring them back into line, but the women have discovered that solidarity provides a measure of protection against individual persecution, and they support each other in their resistance. They begin holding informal gatherings in their homes, discussing religion and morality from perspectives that challenge traditional interpretations, creating a space for questioning that the church has always forbidden. William Harrison faces consequences for his role in printing and distributing Martha's Testament. Reverend Blackwell demands his resignation from the Board of Deacons, accusing him of betrayal and heresy. Harrison refuses to resign, arguing that his actions were consistent with true Christian values even if they violated church policy. The resulting conflict brings underlying tensions within the church leadership to the surface, with some deacons supporting Harrison and others demanding his expulsion. The board splits nearly evenly, unable to achieve the unanimous decision required for Harrison's removal, and Reverend Blackwell finds his authority seriously weakened for the first time in his 15-year tenure. The controversy attracts attention from beyond Watauga County. A journalist from the Raleigh News and Observer, intrigued by reports of book burnings and church schisms in the mountains, travels to Boone to investigate the story. He interviews Martha in her forest camp, struck by her intelligence and dignity, by the contrast between the refined woman before him and the depraved sinner described by church officials. He interviews Reverend Blackwell, Sarah Coleman, William Harrison, and numerous other participants in the drama. His resulting article, published in late May and reprinted in newspapers across North Carolina, presents Martha's story sympathetically, portraying her as a victim of economic hardship and religious intolerance rather than a corrupter of morals. The article brings Martha both validation and new problems. Validation because a respected newspaper has taken her side, lending credibility to her version of events, giving her a public voice that reaches far beyond the isolated mountains where she has lived her entire life. New problems because the publicity makes her visible to authorities who might otherwise have ignored a local dispute. The sheriff of Watauga County, pressured by Reverend Blackwell and conservative church members, reluctantly files charges against Martha for prostitution, forcing her to either leave the county permanently or face arrest and trial. Martha chooses to leave, recognizing that fighting the charges would require resources she does not have and would likely result in conviction regardless of the evidence. William Harrison helps her prepare for departure, providing money collected secretly from sympathizers and arranging transportation to Asheville, a larger city 50 miles south where she might find work and anonymity. The night before she leaves, Sarah Coleman and her small group of dissenting women visit Martha's camp, bringing food and a collection of letters they have written, testimonies from women throughout the county who have read Martha's testament and found in it echoes of their own struggles. These letters reveal the hidden landscape of women's suffering in Appalachian communities, stories of poverty and abuse and isolation that women endured in silence because speaking out would bring only judgment and further hardship. Martha reads the letters by firelight, tears streaming down her face as she realizes that her public humiliation has created space for other women to acknowledge their own pain, that her defiance has given them permission to question the structures that constrain their lives. She carefully packs the letters to take with her, precious evidence that her ordeal has meaning beyond her individual experience. Martha leaves Watauga County on a misty June morning, riding in a wagon driven by Harrison, heading toward an uncertain future in Asheville. She takes with her the letters, a copy of her testament, and the hard-won knowledge that survival sometimes requires courage that appears to others as transgression, that authentic morality cannot always be contained within conventional definitions of proper behavior. She does not look back as the wagon carries her away from the mountains where she has lived her entire life, where she buried her husband and fought for her right to exist on her own terms. In Asheville, Martha finds work in a textile mill, backbreaking labor for minimal wages but honest employment that allows her to rent a small room and support herself without charity or compromise. She uses her evenings to write, producing a longer memoir that expands on her testament, providing more detail about her experiences and developing her philosophy of compassion and resistance. She calls this expanded work Love and Defiance, Meditations on Christian Charity from the Margins of Respectability. She pays to have it printed privately, selling copies by mail to readers who learned about her story from the newspaper article. The book finds a modest but devoted audience, particularly among women in similar circumstances to Martha's earlier situation, widows and single women struggling to survive in a society that offers them few legitimate options. Martha begins corresponding with these readers, offering advice and support, creating an informal network of women who share resources and information about survival strategies. She becomes something of a folk heroine to this underground community, proof that a woman can resist and endure even when the entire weight of religious and social authority presses against her. Back in Watauga County, the conflict Martha's story sparked continues to reshape the community. Reverend Blackwell's congregation dwindles as families leave First Baptist Church, some joining other denominations, others abandoning organized religion entirely. The Reverend grows increasingly rigid and dogmatic, alienating even his most loyal supporters with sermons that emphasize punishment over grace, obedience over understanding. By the end of 1911, his position is untenable, and he reluctantly accepts a posting to a smaller church in Western Virginia, leaving Boone after 16 years of dominating its religious life. His replacement, a younger minister named Thomas Kemp who trained at a progressive seminary in Richmond, brings a different approach to pastoral leadership. Kemp emphasizes social justice and practical charity, organizes the church to provide real assistance to widows and struggling families, and explicitly acknowledges the failures that led to Martha Henley's persecution. He invites Sarah Coleman and the other dissenting women back to church, not demanding their submission but welcoming their questions and their insistence on authentic Christian practice. Gradually, the church transforms, becoming less an instrument of social control and more a genuine community of mutual support. William Harrison, freed from Reverend Blackwell's oversight, becomes increasingly active in regional reform movements. He advocates for better treatment of widows, for legal protections for women's property rights, for expansion of economic opportunities beyond traditional women's work. He maintains correspondence with Martha in Asheville, providing her with news from Watauga County and seeking her advice on how to address women's issues from a male position of relative privilege. Their friendship becomes a model for how men and women can work together for social change despite the power imbalances built into their culture. Martha lives in Asheville for 5 years, gradually building a life that combines factory work, writing, and activism. She never remarries, having learned to value independence too highly to surrender it, but she forms deep friendships with other women who share her commitments and her history of struggle. She becomes involved in the early stirrings of women's suffrage organizing in North Carolina, using her story as an example of why women need political power to protect themselves from institutional injustice. Her testament and her memoir circulate among suffragists and progressive reformers, documents that illustrate the intersection of gender oppression, economic vulnerability, and religious authority. In 1916, at the age of 37, Martha returns to Watauga County for the first time since her exile. The charges against her have been quietly dropped through Kemp's intervention, and she has been invited to speak at the church about her experiences and her perspective on Christian charity. She travels from Asheville with considerable anxiety, uncertain how she will be received, but she finds a community profoundly changed from the one that drove her out 5 years earlier. The church is full when she arrives, with people standing along the walls because there are not enough pews for everyone who wants to hear her speak. Martha stands before the congregation and speaks for an hour, not about her persecution but about what she has learned from it. She talks about the difference between legalistic righteousness and authentic compassion, about the ways religious institutions can become tools of oppression when they prioritize maintaining control over serving people's genuine needs, about the particular vulnerabilities that women face in a society structured around male authority and female submission. She speaks about forgiveness, not the forgiveness she supposedly needs to seek from the church, but the forgiveness she has learned to offer to people who hurt her out of fear and ignorance rather than malice. She ends by reading excerpts from the letters she received from women throughout the county, giving voice to the silent suffering that her own public struggle helped bring to light. The response to Martha's speech is overwhelming. People line up to speak with her afterward, some offering apologies for their role in her persecution, others thanking her for giving them courage to resist their own situations of oppression, still others simply wanting to meet the woman whose story has taken on almost legendary proportions in their community. Sarah Coleman embraces Martha with tears streaming down her face, telling her that her resistance inspired Sarah's own awakening, that Martha's example changed the trajectory of her life. William Harrison introduces Martha to his wife and children, all of whom have heard so much about her that they feel they already know her. Martha spends 3 days in Watauga County, sleeping in Sarah Coleman's home, visiting her old hollow where her former cabin still stands abandoned, speaking at gatherings in neighboring communities about women's rights and economic justice. She finds that she has become a symbol of resistance that extends far beyond her individual story, that people have projected onto her their own hopes for social transformation. She accepts this responsibility with mixed feelings, gratified that her suffering has produced something of value but aware that symbols often obscure the complex humanity of real people. When Martha returns to Asheville, she carries with her a sense of completion, not because her story has a happy ending but because she has seen evidence that struggle produces change, that resistance matters even when it seems futile. She continues her work at the textile mill, continues writing and corresponding with women throughout the region, continues participating in reform movements. She lives to see women gain the right to vote in 1920, casting her ballot with profound satisfaction, knowing that her small acts of defiance contributed in some measure to that larger victory. The story of Martha Henley never entirely fades from memory in Watauga County. Generations later, elderly residents still tell their grandchildren about the widow who defied the church, about the book burning in the town square, about the transformation those events triggered in their community. Historians occasionally discover copies of a widow's testament in attics or estate sales, recognizing them as valuable primary sources for understanding women's history in rural Appalachia. The actual details of Martha's life become somewhat mythologized over time, reality and legend blending together until it becomes difficult to separate what actually happened from what people believe happened. What remains constant across all versions of the story is its essential truth about the cost of resistance and the necessity of courage. Martha Henley was an ordinary woman placed in extraordinary circumstances who chose dignity over submission, who refused to accept others' definitions of her worth and morality, who found her voice and used it to challenge institutional power. She paid an enormous price for these choices, losing her home and community, living in exile and poverty, enduring public humiliation and systemic persecution. But she also gained something that no external authority could give her, the knowledge that she had defined herself on her own terms, that she had fought for what she believed was right regardless of the consequences. The final documented reference to Martha Henley appears in the Asheville City Directory for 1935, listing her as a resident of a boarding house on College Street, employed at Beacon Manufacturing Company. She would have been 56 years old that year, still working despite an age when most women were long retired or dependent on family support. The directory offers no personal details, just a name and address and occupation, reducing a complex and defiant life to a few pieces of bureaucratic information. But even that bare listing testifies to her continued survival, to her stubborn refusal to disappear or surrender despite everything arrayed against her. The mountains of North Carolina endure as they always have, ancient and impassive, witnessing human struggles that seem momentous to those who live them but are barely visible against the vast scale of geological time. The tobacco fields and timber stands that sustained Martha's community gradually give way to tourism and urban development as the 20th century progresses, the old ways dying as younger generations leave for opportunities elsewhere. First Baptist Church of Boone continues to exist, now housed in a modern building quite different from the wooden structure where Reverend Blackwell once preached fire and judgment. Few current members know the story of Martha Henley, and those who do often regard it as an embarrassing episode best forgotten. But forgetting serves no one except those who prefer not to examine their institution's capacity for cruelty justified by righteousness. Martha's story matters precisely because it is uncomfortable, because it forces confrontation with the ways religious authority and social convention can be weaponized against vulnerable people, because it demonstrates that moral courage often looks like transgression to those invested in maintaining the status quo. Her testament, both the original document and the longer memoir that followed, remains available to anyone willing to seek them out, archived in libraries and historical societies, occasionally rediscovered by scholars and activists who recognize their relevance to contemporary struggles. The questions Martha Henley raised in 1911 remain urgent more than a century later. How do we balance communal values with individual autonomy? What obligations do religious institutions have to serve rather than control their members? When is conformity to social norms a form of complicity in injustice? How do women survive and maintain dignity in systems structured to deny them both? What does authentic Christian charity look like when stripped of the power dynamics that so often accompany it? These are not historical questions that can be safely relegated to the past, but living questions that each generation must answer anew through their choices and actions. Martha Henley's life provides no simple answers to these questions, but it offers something perhaps more valuable, an example of one woman's commitment to living authentically despite enormous pressure to conform, to submit, to accept definitions of morality that served others' interests rather than her own well-being or her conscience. She was neither a saint nor a sinner, but a human being trying to survive and maintain her humanity under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. She made choices that many condemned then and many would condemn now, but she made them consciously and defended them courageously, refusing to be silenced or shamed into accepting others' judgment as truth. The final image that emerges from Martha's story is of a woman standing alone in a forest clearing, her possessions stacked under a tree, watching men ride away after evicting her from her home, feeling the weight of absolute isolation and the temptation to surrender to despair. In that moment, she could have broken, could have begged for mercy and promised compliance, could have accepted the church's characterization of her as a sinner in need of saving. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, assessed her situation practically, and began to plan her survival and her resistance. That moment of decision, repeated countless times by countless women throughout history, represents the stubborn persistence of human dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Martha Henley's story is ultimately not about selling love or defying clergy, but about refusing to disappear, insisting on existence and agency even when the world demands submission and silence. That refusal echoes across the decades, inspiring anyone who faces the choice between comfort and authenticity, between conformity and conscience, between survival on others' terms or on one's own. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.